The gym where Jake and Martin worked was a popular spot for locals to sculpt their bodies, sweat off the stresses of the day, and pursue their personal fitness goals. Jake, at 27, had become a fixture at the gym. He was tall, muscular, and imposing. People often commented that his broad shoulders, bulging biceps, and chiseled chest were like something out of a fitness magazine. Jake's passion for fitness was clear to anyone who spent even a few minutes talking to him. Martin, 25, was somewhat smaller in build compared to Jake, but no less impressive. With a lean, muscular frame and a fair complexion, he was known for his agility and athleticism. The two trainers had become good friends over the years, despite their different backgrounds and personalities. They'd bonded over their shared love of fitness and the desire to help others transform their bodies and lives. Together, they trained a wide variety of clients, from athletes looking to take their performance to the next level, to older clients aiming to stay active, to complete beginners hoping to lose weight or build muscle for the first time. The gym may have been a place of sweat, strength, and transformation, but soon it would become the backdrop to something far more sinister. A new client was about to enter their lives, and with her arrival, the carefully constructed world of Jake and Martin would start to unravel. One day, as the steady rhythm of the gym continued, a new client walked through the glass doors. Her presence was commanding, and she turned heads as she strode confidently toward the reception desk. Her name was Jessica, a 57-year-old woman who looked far younger than her years. She had an air of vitality and energy that made her stand out immediately. Her athletic, toned figure was evident beneath her sleek workout gear, which hugged her body in all the right places. Her skin was smooth, slightly tanned, and her sharp, youthful features belied her age. Her eyes sparkled with mischief, and her smile was warm yet suggestive, as though she knew she could capture anyone's attention with just a glance. That day, Martin was manning the front desk while Jake finished up a session in the back. He watched as Jessica approached, her hips swaying ever so slightly. She introduced herself with a firm handshake and said she was interested in starting a fitness regimen. "I'm not a stranger to the gym," she said, her voice low and husky, "but I need some help getting back into my routine. I haven't worked with a personal trainer before, but I think it's time." She looked directly at Martin, her gaze holding his for a moment longer than seemed necessary. Martin, ever the professional, pulled up the gym's schedule and began to ask her about her goals. As she spoke, it became clear that Jessica was not your average client. Her body was lean and toned, especially for someone her age, and her confidence was unmistakable. She was no stranger to fitness. Her responses indicated that she had maintained a high level of physical activity throughout her life, but she now wanted to take things up a notch. As they talked, Martin found himself mesmerized by her. There was something intoxicating about the way she carried herself, the way her eyes lingered on him as she spoke. At first, he estimated her to be in her early 40s, her vibrant appearance making her seem far younger than her actual age. She had an alluring charm that wasn't overtly sexual, but there was an undeniable undertone to her behavior. Jessica didn't hesitate in choosing a trainer. "I'd like you to train me," she said with a smile that could melt steel. Martin agreed and scheduled her for a session later in the week, feeling a slight twinge of excitement. She gave off an aura of someone who knew what she wanted and how to get it. Martin had trained countless clients before, but there was something different about Jessica. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but he brushed it off as just another day at work. Their first training session began innocently enough. Jessica came in wearing sleek, form-fitting workout attire that accentuated her figure. As they went through the initial warm-up exercises, Martin noticed how her movements were fluid and confident. She was clearly experienced, and Martin found it easy to guide her through more advanced exercises. But as the session progressed, he began to notice something else. Jessica's behavior was slightly flirtatious. At first, it was just little things, a playful smile here, a soft laugh there, her hand lingering a little too long when he helped adjust her posture. It was nothing overt, but it was enough to make Martin take notice. Jessica would ask him to demonstrate certain exercises, and when he did, she would move closer, almost brushing against him as she watched. She asked for his help with her form, and when he placed his hands on her to guide her, she glanced up at him with a coquettish smile. There was something deliberate about the way she flirted, subtle but unmistakable. She wasn't the kind of woman who blushed or played shy. Instead, her confidence was alluring, and she seemed to enjoy teasing Martin in a way that made him slightly uncomfortable, yet intrigued. Martin was aware of the unspoken rules about keeping things professional with clients, and he had always been careful to maintain that boundary. But Jessica's energy was hard to ignore. She was magnetic, and it was as though she knew exactly how to push the right buttons without ever crossing a line. As the sessions continued over the next few weeks, the flirting grew more pronounced. Jessica would compliment Martin on his physique, her eyes lingering on his muscles as he demonstrated exercises. She made small, suggestive remarks about his strength, her tone always playful but laced with something more. Whenever she asked him to correct her form, she would press herself just a little too close to him, making sure that their bodies touched, even if briefly. Martin found himself both flattered and conflicted. He had never experienced this kind of attention from a client before, and he wasn't sure how to handle it. Every time they trained together, Jessica's flirting escalated. She would find ways to brush against him as they moved through exercises, her body inching closer to his with every session. She would laugh a little too easily at his jokes, her laughter bubbling up in a way that made Martin feel like she was inviting him to cross a line. And yet, she never said anything directly. It was all unspoken, an undercurrent that ran just beneath the surface of their interactions. Martin knew he should put a stop to it. He told himself it was just harmless flirting, that Jessica was probably just trying to make her sessions more enjoyable. But as the weeks passed, he couldn't shake the feeling that something more was at play. He found himself looking forward to her sessions, wondering what new way she would find to flirt with him. He had always been good at maintaining boundaries with clients, but Jessica was different. There was something about her that made it difficult to stay focused, something that made him want to blur the lines. One day, during a particularly intense training session, Jessica asked him to show her how to do a more advanced weightlifting technique. As Martin stood behind her, guiding her through the movements, he could feel the warmth of her body against his. She leaned into him, her breath quickening as she lifted the weights. When she finished the set, she turned to him, her face flushed with exertion, but her eyes full of mischief. She smiled, that same teasing smile, and said, "You know, Martin, you make it hard to concentrate." Martin laughed it off, trying to maintain his composure. But inside, he felt the pull of temptation growing stronger. There was no denying the chemistry between them, and though he tried to keep things professional, it was becoming harder and harder to resist. Jessica was unlike any client he had ever worked with, confident, flirtatious, and completely unapologetic about the way she carried herself. And the more time they spent together, the more Martin found himself drawn to her, despite the voice in the back of his head telling him to keep his distance. Standing at the reception desk, Martin's thoughts drifted back to the last training session he'd had with Jessica. Her flirtatious energy lingered in his mind, especially the way she had subtly pressed her body against his during the exercises, her eyes full of playful intent. It was becoming more difficult to ignore the tension that had been building between them, despite his best efforts to maintain professionalism. Next to him, Jake was busy mixing his protein shake, watching Martin with a knowing smirk. Jake had noticed the dynamic between Martin and Jessica long ago. It wasn't hard to see the way she acted around him, how she always seemed to touch him just a bit too long, how her playful smiles lingered a little too much. Jake found the whole situation amusing and decided to tease his colleague about it, a habit he had picked up over the years they had worked together. He liked to rib Martin, and Jessica's growing interest in him provided endless material. Jake had noticed how Jessica carried herself in the gym. For a woman of her age, she exuded a level of confidence and sexuality that was hard to ignore. She knew what she wanted and wasn't shy about showing it, especially around Martin. Jake, seeing the opportunity for some lighthearted fun, couldn't help but point it out to Martin in his usual bantering way. The flirtation was obvious to everyone, and he found it funny that Martin seemed to be brushing it off as if nothing was happening. Despite this, Martin tried to stay focused on his job. He had always prided himself on keeping things professional with clients, and Jessica should have been no different. But her teasing, the way she moved when they trained, her playful touches, everything was blurring the lines in ways he hadn't anticipated. Even as Jake ribbed him, Martin couldn't shake the feeling that things were becoming more complicated than they should have been. As they stood at the desk, Jessica appeared, making her usual confident entrance into the gym. She moved with a grace that drew attention, her form-fitting workout clothes highlighting her toned physique. She carried herself with the same confidence she had in her training sessions, an aura of assuredness that seemed to attract the gaze of everyone she passed. Her presence was impossible to ignore. Jessica made her way toward the two trainers, her body language radiating playful energy. Her eyes flickered between Martin and Jake, as though assessing the situation before approaching. It was clear she enjoyed the attention she received, and as she neared the reception desk, she wore the same mischievous smile she had often shown during her training sessions with Martin. She carried herself with a kind of allure that felt both challenging and enticing, and Martin, despite his efforts to remain professional, couldn't help but feel the pull of her presence. Jake, watching the interaction unfold, found it amusing. He had always been the more laid-back of the two, and to him, this whole situation seemed like a source of endless entertainment. The way Jessica carried herself, the way she so clearly flirted with Martin, it was all too perfect. Jake had seen this kind of thing before, but rarely with such intensity. He was thoroughly entertained by how Martin was trying to keep his cool, even as Jessica's intentions became more and more obvious. The following week arrived without any signs of change from Jessica. As Martin prepared for her session, Jake stood nearby, eyeing his friend with a knowing grin. During their training sessions, Jessica's questions slowly became more personal. While she had initially seemed focused on fitness, it became clear she was also trying to learn more about Martin. One day, as they were cooling down after a workout, she casually inquired about his personal life. Her tone was light, but her eyes were keen, probing. In a moment of unexpected vulnerability, Martin admitted that he was currently single. He didn't dwell on it or offer more detail than necessary, but it was enough to shift something between them. Jessica seemed to file the information away, her playful flirting growing even more pronounced in the days that followed. No one could have predicted what would happen next. After one particularly intense training session, Jake mentioned that he needed to step out to grab something from the store. It was late in the day, and the gym had mostly emptied out, leaving Martin and Jessica alone. As Jake was leaving, Jessica approached Martin and mentioned, almost offhandedly, that she had lost her gym locker key. It seemed like an innocent enough request, so Martin offered to help her get a new one from the trainer's room, where spare keys were kept. The two of them walked down the hallway toward the room, the gym silent except for the distant hum of equipment being turned off for the night. As soon as they entered, something shifted in the air. Jessica moved with an unexpected swiftness, turning abruptly and slamming the door shut behind her. The sudden sound startled Martin, and before he could ask what was going on, she was in front of him, her hands already reaching for him. There was no time to react, no moment for protest. Jessica pressed herself against him, her lips crushing against his in a kiss that took him completely by surprise. Martin stood frozen, shocked by the sudden turn of events. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening, but everything seemed to blur together. Before he could comprehend the situation, Jessica's hands were on his waistband, pulling down his pants with quick, decisive movements. Jessica, with a casualness that bordered on surreal, straightened up, adjusted her clothes, and left the room without a word. When Jake returned from the store, Martin was still standing in the trainer's room, his face pale and his expression blank. Jake immediately noticed the strange look on Martin's face and couldn't help but tease him, asking what had happened while he was gone. Martin, still in shock, mumbled an explanation, recounting the brief but intense encounter with Jessica. Jake's reaction was immediate and explosive. He erupted into laughter, practically doubling over as he howled with amusement. His booming laughter echoed through the gym, and he slapped his thigh in disbelief. The situation was so absurd, so unexpected, that Jake found it nothing short of hilarious. To him, the idea of a client, especially someone like Jessica, throwing herself at Martin in such a bold manner was the height of comedy. He jumped around in exaggerated excitement, mimicking the absurdity of it all. The following week arrived without any signs of change from Jessica. She entered the gym with the same air of confidence, as though nothing out of the ordinary had occurred during her last session. Jessica moved through the session with her usual grace and focus, but there was no denying the undercurrent of tension. Then, midway through the session, Jessica dropped a bombshell. Casually, as though it were the most natural thing in the world, she suggested that Martin come to her place that evening. Her words were light, her tone teasing, but the invitation was clear. And in an even bolder move, she added that Martin should bring Jake along with him. The moment hung in the air like an electric charge. Martin was momentarily taken aback, unsure of what to say or do. The suggestion was so audacious, so unexpected, that he couldn't quite believe she had said it. But Jessica's tone remained light, her body language relaxed, as though she had simply invited them over for coffee. It was as if she had said something completely normal, yet the meaning behind her words was anything but. After the session ended, Martin relayed Jessica's proposition to Jake. As expected, Jake's reaction was immediate and animated. His eyes widened with excitement, his body practically vibrating with energy. It was clear that Jake found the whole thing thrilling. He had been joking about Martin's situation for weeks, but now, with the offer of a real encounter on the table, his amusement turned into something more eager, more primal. That night, they both made their way to Jessica's place. As they arrived, the atmosphere was heavy with expectation, the tension between them almost tangible. Jessica welcomed them into her home with a bright smile, as though she had been expecting them all along. Dinner was served, and it was clear that Jessica knew how to host. She moved with the same confidence she always had, her every gesture deliberate and poised. As the evening progressed, the barriers between them began to dissolve. Jessica, still as bold as ever, made the first move. She stood from the table and walked around to where Martin was sitting, her hand brushing his shoulder as she passed. Then, with a slow and deliberate motion, she leaned in and kissed him, her lips lingering on his as her hand traced a path down his chest. Martin's breath caught in his throat, but before he could fully react, she turned to Jake, who was watching intently from across the table. Without missing a beat, she made her way over to Jake, her fingers sliding along the back of his neck as she pulled him into a kiss as well. There was no hesitation, no awkwardness in her movements. She was in complete control of the situation, guiding them both with a confidence that left no room for doubt. Despite what had happened, Martin continued to train Jessica in the days that followed. However, something had changed between them. Jessica's attitude shifted subtly. Her flirtations cooled, her once playful touches now absent. The energy between them had shifted. She still smiled and spoke with the same warmth, but the electric tension that had once defined their interactions was gone. Martin couldn't help but feel the difference. Jessica was no longer as interested in him. The change was small but noticeable, and it left him with an unsettling feeling in his chest. It wasn't until Jake revealed the truth that Martin understood why. One day after a session, Jake casually mentioned that Jessica had invited him over. Unlike before, there was no invitation for Martin, only Jake. It hit Martin hard, the realization that Jessica's attention had shifted away from him and onto his friend. The coldness in her attitude toward him suddenly made sense. She wasn't interested in him anymore. The next day, Jake returned to the gym, his face lit with excitement as he described the night he had spent with Jessica. He spoke of her energy, how alive she was, how, Despite her age, she had an intensity that drew him in. Jake's enthusiasm only deepened the sting of betrayal Martin felt. His chest tightened as he listened to Jake's animated description of Jessica, of the night that had been meant for both of them, but ended up being just for Jake. The sense of betrayal gnawed at Martin like a festering wound. He couldn't believe what had happened. Not long ago, Jessica had been throwing herself at him, her flirtations heating up to the point of intimacy. Now, it was as if he had become invisible to her. The fact that she had not only shifted her attention to Jake, but had gone so far as to cancel her training sessions with Martin entirely left him feeling hollow and humiliated. Jessica's sudden disinterest in him was compounded by the fact that she now exclusively wanted to spend time with Jake, a bitter realization that made Martin's stomach churn with anger and jealousy. Jake would describe how vibrant Jessica was, how alive she seemed when they were together, as if her age didn't matter at all. He talked about her confidence, her energy, and how she seemed to defy all expectations of what someone her age could be. And every time Jake spoke, Martin could only listen in silence, nodding along while the bitterness inside him deepened. What made it worse was that Jake didn't seem to realize just how hurt Martin was. To Jake, this was just another story, another adventure. But to Martin, it felt like a personal betrayal, not only by Jessica, but by his closest friend. The more Martin dwelled on the situation, the angrier he became. He felt used, discarded by Jessica as soon as she found someone more to her liking. The thought of her choosing Jake over him, of spending nights with Jake instead of him, burned in his mind. He couldn't escape the image of them together. Jessica's laughter, her flirtation, her body pressed against Jake's in the same way she had once pressed herself against him. It was unbearable. One day, Martin reached his breaking point. The weight of everything, the jealousy, the betrayal, the rejection, became too much to bear. He decided that he couldn't just let things go, couldn't allow Jessica to humiliate him like this. He needed to confront her, to understand why she had discarded him so easily, why she had chosen Jake over him. The need for closure, or perhaps revenge, fueled his decision. He felt an uncontrollable urge to face her, to make her explain herself. That evening, Martin made his way to Jessica's apartment. His heart pounded in his chest as he climbed the stairs to her door, his mind swirling with a toxic mix of anger, jealousy, and desperation. By the time he reached her door, he was shaking with a barely contained rage. He knocked, and moments later, Jessica opened the door, her expression as calm and flirtatious as ever, completely unfazed by his sudden appearance. But what Martin had hoped would be a conversation, an explanation, quickly devolved into something far darker. As soon as he stepped inside, he was met with the same cool indifference that had been gnawing at him for weeks. Jessica acted as though nothing had happened between them, as though he were just another trainer, just another man who had passed through her life. She gave him a look of casual amusement, her eyes glinting with a hint of mischief, as if she were toying with him, playing a game in which he was the pawn. When Martin pressed her, asking why she had chosen Jake over him, why she had discarded him so easily, Jessica's response cut him like a knife. She looked at him with a smirk and brushed off his concerns, dismissing him with a few cruel words. She made it clear that she wasn't interested in him anymore, that Jake was better in every way, more exciting, more satisfying, more everything. Martin, she implied, had been nothing more than a temporary distraction, someone she had already grown bored with. At that moment, something inside Martin snapped. The rage that had been building inside him for days, weeks, exploded to the surface in a violent outburst. He lunged at Jessica, grabbing her by the arms, his vision clouded by a mix of fury and confusion. He didn't know what he was doing. He only knew that he couldn't take her cruelty any longer. For a brief moment, it seemed as though he might lose complete control, but at the last second, some small part of him forced him to stop. He let go of her, taking a step back, horrified by what he had almost done. His hand shook, his breathing ragged as he tried to regain control of himself, try to understand what had just happened. He had come so close to doing something unforgivable, something he could never take back. But Jessica, ever the provocateur, didn't seem fazed by his outburst. Instead, she looked at him with a smirk, her voice dripping with venom, as she taunted him once more. She called him pathetic, a sucker, mocking him for not even being capable of going through with it. Her words were like gasoline on a fire, reigniting the fury that had just begun to subside. In a blind, uncontrollable rage, Martin lost all sense of reason. His fists flew before he could stop them, connecting with Jessica's body with brutal force. He didn't even realize what he was doing until it was too late. The red haze of anger had taken over, and by the time it lifted, Jessica was lying on the floor, her body still, her face bloodied and bruised. It took a moment for the reality of the situation to sink in. Martin stood there, staring down at Jessica's lifeless body, his mind unable to process what had just happened. His breath came in short, panicked gasps as the full weight of his actions hit him like a tidal wave. He had killed her. In his blind rage, he had done the unthinkable. Panic surged through him. He had to get out of there. Without thinking, he bolted from the apartment, his heart racing, his mind in a complete state of shock. The next morning, Martin awoke in a haze. His mind was clouded, as if the events of the previous night were just fragments of a nightmare. But as soon as he opened his eyes and felt the soreness in his knuckles, the reality came crashing down on him with crushing weight. Jessica was dead. He had killed her. The memory of her lying lifeless on the floor, her face bruised and still, flashed through his mind like a jolt of electricity, sending a wave of nausea through his body. The panic that had overtaken him the night before returned with a vengeance. His hands were trembling as he stared down at them, the raw skin on his knuckles still red and swollen from where he had struck her. He hadn't wrapped them properly for the gym, but there was no time for that now. All he could think about was how to mask the evidence, how to explain the state of his hands when he inevitably faced Jake and everyone else at the gym. But what terrified him more than anything was the idea that someone might already know. Had anyone seen him leave Jessica's apartment? Could anyone have heard the commotion, the thud of her body hitting the floor? The fear was almost suffocating. His mind raced through every possible scenario, each one more horrifying than the last. He needed to keep calm, to act as if nothing had happened, but the gnawing guilt and panic made that almost impossible. Somehow, he managed to drag himself out of bed and head to the gym, his fists hastily wrapped in bandages to hide the damage. His heart was pounding the entire time, every step feeling like he was walking toward his own execution. The weight of what he had done was unbearable, and he could feel it pressing down on him with each passing minute. Every face he passed on the street seemed to know his secret. Every glance felt like an accusation. By the time he arrived at the gym, he was barely holding it together. Jake was already there, mixing protein shakes at the reception desk, as carefree and full of energy as always. When Jake noticed the bandages on Martin's hands, he didn't seem particularly concerned. He asked about them in passing, but Martin brushed off the question with a flimsy excuse about boxing the previous night. Jake, always quick to believe whatever Martin told him, didn't press further. To him, the bandages were just a minor detail, something easily explained away. He had no idea what had really happened, no idea of the storm that was about to hit. The gym was busy as usual, clients moving through their routines, trainers guiding them through their workouts. On the surface, it was just another day. But beneath that facade, Martin felt like he was drowning. The sight of them walking into the gym sent a shockwave through Martin. His stomach lurched, and he could feel the blood drain from his face. It was as though the world had stopped spinning for a moment, everything slowing to a crawl as the officers approached the reception desk. He tried to act natural, to stay calm, but the panic was screaming inside him, threatening to break through his facade at any second. The officers spoke with Jake first, asking him a few routine questions, but it quickly became apparent why they were there. One of the officers explained that a woman named Jessica had been found dead in her apartment, and she registered in this gym before. It didn't take long for the conversation to turn to Jake. One of the neighbors had seen a tall black man near Jessica's apartment the previous evening. That detail alone was enough to shift the focus of the investigation onto Jake. The police officers asked him more pointed questions, and though Jake maintained his composure, Martin could see the confusion in his friend's eyes. Jake had no idea what was happening, no idea why the police were even looking at him. Then one of the officers glanced at Martin's bandaged hands. It was as if time stood still. The officer's gaze lingered there for a moment too long, and Martin could feel the weight of that look like a hammer over his head. His heart began to race again, faster than before, as the officer asked what had happened to his hands. The flimsy excuse about boxing no longer felt like it would hold up under scrutiny, but Martin tried to keep his voice steady as he repeated the lie. The police weren't convinced. The questions became more direct, more probing, and it became clear that they suspected something was wrong. Jake, still confused but trying to defend himself, didn't know what to say. He had no idea that Martin was involved, no idea that the very person he trusted was the one responsible for Jessica's death. Then came the moment Martin had been dreading. The police arrested Jake on the spot. The neighbor's testimony, combined with Jake's proximity to Jessica, was enough for them to take him into custody. Martin watched as they put handcuffs on his friend, the shock and confusion on Jake's face unmistakable. Jake was protesting, insisting that he hadn't done anything, but the officers weren't listening. They were focused on the evidence they had: the sighting of Jake near Jessica's apartment, and the fact that Jessica had been seeing Jake recently. But even as Jake was led away in handcuffs, Martin's guilt was becoming too much to bear. The sight of his friend, who was innocent, being taken away for something he hadn't done gnawed at Martin's conscience like a cancer. His mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions: fear, guilt, panic. But above all, there was the overwhelming sense of betrayal. Jake had been nothing but a friend to him, and now he was about to pay the price for something Martin had done in a fit of rage. The police had noticed Martin's hands, and though they hadn't arrested him yet, he could feel their suspicions growing. It was only a matter of time before they connected the dots, before they realized that Martin was the one who had killed Jessica. His guilt, his bandaged hands, the lies, everything was crumbling around him. Martin couldn't let Jake take the fall. As the police began to lead Jake out of the gym, something inside Martin snapped again, but this time it wasn't rage. It was the crushing weight of guilt that forced him to act. He couldn't let his friend go down for this. He couldn't watch as Jake was blamed for something he hadn't done, for something Martin had done in a moment of blind, uncontrollable rage. Before he knew what he was doing, Martin spoke up. His voice cracked as he began to confess, each word tearing itself out of him like a painful extraction. He admitted everything. He told the officers about his relationship with Jessica, about how things had spiraled out of control, about his jealousy and the way Jessica had humiliated him. He explained how he had gone to her apartment to confront her and how things had escalated to violence. He confessed to killing her in a fit of rage, unable to control himself after everything she had said. The room fell silent as Martin's confession filled the air. The officers turned their attention to him, their eyes narrowing as they processed his words. Jake, still in handcuffs, looked at Martin with a mixture of shock and disbelief. The betrayal was written all over his face, but there was also a strange sense of relief. Martin had come clean. He had told the truth. Ultimately, the verdict was reached. Martin was found guilty of first-degree murder, a decision that was met with a mixture of relief and sadness. The jury's decision reflected the severity of the crime and the undeniable evidence of Martin's guilt. The court sentenced Martin to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, a sentence that reflected the gravity of his actions and the irrevocable impact on Jessica's life.